Well, hello, my name is Brad Wetzler, and this is Writing for Peace Sunday Live Lit Reading. And tonight we have a very special guest in Scott Nadelson, and I'm really looking forward to tonight. So I want to begin by reading a bio of Scott. Scott Nadelson grew up in northern New Jersey before escaping to Oregon, where he has lived for the past 24 years. He has published 4 collections of short stories: The Fourth Corner of the World, named Jewish Fiction Prize Honor Book by the Association of Jewish Libraries; Aftermath, The Cantor's Daughter, and Saving Stanley, The Brickman Stories, and a memoir, The Next Scott Nadelson, A Life in Progress. His novel Between You and Me was published by Engine Books in 2015, and his new story collection, One of Us, will be published by BKMK Press in October 2020. Winner of the Reformed Judaism Fiction Prize, the Great Lakes Colleges Association New Writers Award, and an Oregon Book Award, Scott's work has appeared in a variety of magazines and literary journals, including Plowshares, The Southern Review, New England Review, Harvard Review, Glimmer Train, and Crazy Horse. And his work has been cited as a distinguished in both the Best American Short Stories and Best American Essays anthologies. He teaches at Willamette University, where he is Hallie Brown Ford Chair in Writing, and in the Rainier Writing Workshop MFA program at Pacific Lutheran University. Well, welcome, Scott. Thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. And thanks to Juniper for inviting me.
Well, great. Well, I'd like to begin with a question that I ask each of the writers who are on each week. And the question is, what book changed everything for you when you were a young person?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I was thinking about it just in the last couple of minutes after you said it. And you know, unlike a lot of writers I know, I was not a big reader as a kid, and I came to it late. But I do remember there's a particular period late in my high school career, and it was poetry that first got me. And I can really remember the exact day. I was one of those kids in high school who kind of had his head down on the desk through most of English class. Didn't see its purpose and how it applied to me at all. And one day in that class, we read 2 poems. One of them was T.S. Eliot's, not The Wasteland, but The Hollow Men, and Dylan Thomas's Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. And it was like light bulbs went off, and I heard language in a way that spoke to me and meant something to me, and the first time in my entire life. And that was it. That was at that moment. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to write poetry, and I was really bad at it. So eventually I found my way to fiction. But that was a big turning point for me, for sure. I was probably 16, almost 17.
Let me ask a quick follow-up question. I hear you that light bulbs went off. Do you remember how either of those poems made you feel?
Well, I do remember that The Hollow Man, you know, sort of caught my attention, especially with its just sense of playfulness and doom, and that combination of the two really it spoke to a kind of absurdity that seemed to make a lot of sense to me. And then in the Thomas poem, just the overwhelming sense of emotion, and the sort of the pleading with the father to fight against the darkness at the end of that poem, the turn it makes. And I think just form more than anything caught me, just the perfection of that poem, and the beauty of that form just astonished me and made me want to make things.
Will you paint a quick picture, real or slightly fabricated, of the scene of where you were reading that poem? I mean, I think you're from northern New Jersey, right?
Yeah, so it was in high school class, my junior high school class. And I can picture the teacher, whose name has escaped me, but she was this tiny little woman with this, you know, sort of bowl haircut. And I don't think I heard a word she said all year. It was all just sort of washed over me. And she read those poems, and it was a, sort of a huge high school, 2,000 kid public high school, with sort of lifeless gray walls, and not for me, not much going on, and just hearing that language coming out of nowhere there it was a shock to me.
Well, great. Well, I'd like to have you start reading. What do you have planned to read tonight?
So I'm going to read from my new book of collection of short stories, which is called One of Us. And as the title kind of implies, the book is really about the tension between individuals and groups, and about belonging and alienation, and who we identify with, and who we sort of see as part of a group or other. And the story I'm going to read from, so the book covers a lot of ground. Some of the stories in here are very autobiographical. Some of them are historical, and I'm going to read one of the historical stories. So I started writing these stories pretty soon after the last election. So I started writing these in late 2016, early 2017. And during that time, one of the things that I found that helped me through that difficult period was finding resistance, or sort of a kind of resistance in comedians, in comedy. And I found myself going to comedians often and looking to comedians for solace, as well as a sort of sense of how do you manage an incredibly difficult time. How do you not accept the things that are coming at you? And that kind of interest in, so a lot of contemporary comedians, but that interest in comedians brought me to do some research about comedians who had provided resistance in an earlier political time. And in particular, I found my way to the comedian Zero Mostel during the blacklist period of the 1950s. And in particular, I found my way to his transcripts of his trial in front of the House Un-American Affairs Committee. And so I was just going to, if Juniper, if you would allow me to share my screen here, I'll just show you a very brief clip of Zero Mostel, which really got me just so interested in him as a figure. Just if you don't know who he is. So, well, here's probably one of the more famous images of him. This is from the film The Producers from the late 1960s with Gene Wilder, the great Mel Brooks film. So this is later in his career, after the blacklist period. And then I'll just show you a very brief clip from an interview he gave with Dick Cavett in 1970, and it's 1971, and it's really worth watching. This whole episode is on YouTube, and worth a look, because Zero Mostel is really just one of the greatest improvisers on stage. For an hour long, he just riffs with Dick Cavett, keeps Dick Cavett completely off his game the whole time. And it's one of the funniest things I've ever seen, and as well as being really quite brilliant.
See him just now. Mr. Zero Mostel, now!
So I'll just stop it there. It's very much worth watching, but just so you have him in mind as I read. So the story that I'm going to read from takes place about 20 years before that clip. And the story is called Butterfly at Rest. And I think what I'll do is read the first part of it, which is really the setup of the story. And then I'll pause, and maybe we'll chat a little bit, and then I will read the rest of the story to finish up. Can you all hear me pretty well? I sound good? Awesome.
Yep.
All right, butterfly at rest. He's been blacklisted 4 years already when the committee finally calls him to testify. Does that mean he has nothing to lose? There's always more they can take from you, even if your name is zero. Dignity, conscience, honor. Maybe he can live without those things. But they can't have my balls, he tells his friends. I don't care how sharp their knives are. He's hardly worked since 1951, when 20th Century Fox canceled his contract and Columbia barred him from their lot, neither offering any explanation other than to say he was no longer welcome. It was another year before Martin Berkeley gave his name to the House Un-American Affairs Committee, and by then he'd returned to New York, retreated to his painting studio, where he has spent more happy hours than any since his days at CCNY, when he took the same introductory art classes half a dozen times because no higher levels were offered. This is his first love, moving paint across canvas, more than performing ever has been. More, too, than his first wife, who has never understood why he needed to spend so much time alone, or worse, with his unkempt artist friends who clammed up as soon as she walked into the room. She left him after 2 years, and he was only mildly sorry to see her go. I just realized I should make Juniper host again. Okay, I will continue. His current wife, Kate, understands better. She loves art, takes painting classes from his friend Henry Callum, but she too wishes he would let her spend more time with him in his studio on 28th Street, in the middle of the Flower District, in what had been a junk heap of a loft before he signed the lease that allows him to rent it for almost nothing. Henry's studio is only a block away, and after her lessons, she makes unannounced appearances while he's working, though usually she knows better than to linger more than a few minutes before catching the subway back to their apartment on West 86th. In general, she objects to his solitude less often than his first wife did, accepts discomfort as a condition of marriage. Perhaps because she's a Gentile and wasn't trained, as his sisters were, to badger a husband into becoming the man you need him to be. If only painting would pay the bills, he would be content. He need never step onto a stage or a set again. But he's exhausted most of the money he saved during his productive years, when he had 2 television programs broadcasting simultaneously, Off the Record on WABD and Channel Zero on WPIX. He can no longer recall the energy it must have taken to put in so many hours, and he supposes that had his good run continued, it would already have killed him. Now, at 40, he finds himself winded when climbing stairs. He's always been a big man, but he's put on weight at a new pace since doors started closing on him. Before 1955 is over, he fears he'll top 250 pounds. Those few booking agents who still call him to perform stand-up in downtown clubs or Catskills hotels for a fraction of his former fee refer to him to club owners as, quote, the funny fat guy. If Kate is in the room when he answers these calls, he always accepts the booking. Often, she answers and accepts on his behalf. But if she happens to be out of the apartment when the phone rings, he makes an excuse, says he's already booked for that night, and hangs up happy, ready to ride downtown and return to his newest painting. He works in figures still, though they've become increasingly abstract, and most gallerists laugh when he shows them his work. What the more serious among them agree is that he has a feel for color, which he learned by repeatedly copying his favorite painting at the Met, John White Alexander's Study in Black and Green. What's white and black and green all over, he used to ask the museum guards, lifting those eyebrows he'd later use on screen for comic effect. I am, obviously. But a feel for color doesn't sell, the gallerists tell him, and so he drags himself once or twice a month to downtown clubs where no one cares if he's been accused of communist activities, so long as he makes them laugh. No one except the owners, who can use it as an excuse to hand him a check for half the agreed upon fee, shrug and say, take it or leave it, after he's already finished his set and it's too late for him to walk away. Kate resents his painting, he has no doubt, even if she keeps it mostly to herself. And he can't blame her for wishing things were different. She's had to go back to dancing to help make the rent, long-legged Kate, who performed as a rockette when they were first introduced. She's a talented actress, but few producers have ever paid her to do anything other than swing her feet in the air and let everyone get a good look at her thighs. Those thighs are still worth looking at, even after a pair of baby boys have squeezed out between them. The boys are now 7 and 9 with appetites like their fathers. They eat far more in a month than a handful of stand-up performances can feed them. So Kate teaches modern dance to uncoordinated housewives, stuffs cash into her dresser drawer, and gives him quick, bitter glances as he wipes the remains of breakfast from his mouth and sidles out the door. He doesn't need to remind her that if not for painting, he would have never found his way into comedy, would never have met her after a show. It started when he was still an art student, earning a few dollars, giving gallery talks in museums around the city as part of the WPA's federal art project. He was nervous standing in front of so many people, talking about paintings he loved, and he worried he'd sweat through his suit. So, to distract his audience, he cracked jokes about Picasso's underwear, about the warped glasses that made Monet see everything blurry. Humor came naturally to him. Jokes were the only way to be heard in his family, with 8 kids and 2 parents constantly shouting over each other. But in the museum galleries, he felt something rising from deep within him, something he only vaguely recognized, and it took over his huge body, infused it with frantic gestures, made words come whipping out of his mouth before he thought to shape them. And he gathered larger and larger crowds, some members of which invited him to repeat his routine for private parties and charity events. Before long, he was performing weekly at the Cafe Society, and his brushes lay largely abandoned, though he never stopped hearing their call, never stopped telling himself that once he'd earned enough from the radio and television shows, from his film contracts, he'd take a long break and spend a year, 2 years, doing nothing but painting. Isn't it ironic, then, that it has taken a collection of fascists and collaborators to grant his wish? Nearly 5 years, and he's produced more artwork than he'd ever dreamed of making, even if no one buys it. But this pace is soon to be interrupted. Over the summer, he was cast in a play for the first time in several years, filling in for a vacationing Buddy Hackett in Lunatics and Lovers. It was a successful enough run that he's since been hired to take the lead in the West Coast production, 3 months in Los Angeles and San Francisco. Before leaving, he's desperate to finish one last painting, a self-portrait that's also a tribute to Chaplin, 2 small bowler hat perched atop his thinning hair. He's working on the eyes, trying to shift the somberness out of them, turn them playful, or at least sly, when Kate knocks on the studio door. He knows the sound of her knuckles, 2 tentative taps of her wedding ring, followed by a more insistent thud. He never locks the door while he's inside, but usually she stays on the landing until he lumbers across the room and opens it for her. This time, however, she walks in without waiting for an answer. It came, she says, and hands him the letter. It was sent by registered mail, addressed to Sam Mostel, and the envelope is printed with the return address of the United States House of Representatives. He's to appear before the HUAC subcommittee in Hollywood on October 14th. The letter advises him to bring legal counsel. They waited until they didn't have to pay for my flight, he says, the cheapskates. I've already called Sam Jaffe, and he called the Ostros. They found you a lawyer, name's Gladstein. A Pinko Jew to represent a Pinko Jew. I'm sure the committee will love him. He's doing it for free, she says, so don't complain. Then she hugs him quickly and steps back. Across her pale blue dress, from left shoulder to right breast, curves an elegant smudge of lavender paint. My masterpiece, he says. Don't you ever shut up, she asks, and weeps. So that's the setup for the story, and I'll pause there, and maybe we can chat a little bit and see if you have any questions, and then I'll read the rest of the story, which takes us into his appearance in front of the House Un-American Affairs Committee.
Yeah, great. How do you pronounce his name again?
Zero Mostel.
Zero Mostel. Can you tell me how you found out about him, or how you landed on him as you started to create a character from him?
Well, I mean, I've always been a fan. I love the producers, especially, but I also I've seen him in some other. So he died in I want to say in the early 80s, maybe even the late 70s. So he was kind of before my time. but I've seen his films over time, and I knew he was the original lead in Fiddler on the Roof. And so I guess, how did I find my way to him? In about 2000, early 2017, I was watching a lot of comedy and looking for comedians who could give me some solace and some escape, and just give me a laugh when I needed one. And I think I was watching a clip of a Rodney Dangerfield's stand-up bit on the Dick Cavett show, which then led me to this Dick Cavett show with Zero Mostel that I showed you, and it was one of the funniest things I've ever seen. And I decided I just needed to know more about him. And as a fiction writer, I'm always looking for subject matter, and I'm always thinking about when I run out of autobiographical material, I'm looking outward and looking elsewhere. And that often leads me to reading biographies of various people and historical figures. And he was one whose autobiography was, there's enough overlap with my family history. His family came from a similar part of Russia that my family came from. So that intrigued me, and I just wanted to learn more about him. And I really did not know about his the blacklisting and his appearance in front of the HUAC. But when I came across the transcript, as you'll see when I read the scene of his trial, I thought, oh, this is a story that I wish everybody knew, and that's really what led me to write the story.
Well, one of the reasons I asked is, when I see a character like him, I pick up, all that simultaneous brilliance and shadow, with these comedians like this. And I guess you talked about absurdity kind of being fuel for your interest in writing as a young age. And I don't know, can you talk about how he is alive in you as a writer?
I think the other thing that really spoke to me about him that I had no idea until I started reading about him was that, which really becomes the center of the story, is that performing comedy was not his first love. That painting was his first love, and that was the thing that he really wished he could have done. And even after he came back to performing and had a successful career and became very famous, continued with his painting. And did finally have some gallery shows, but mostly because he was famous. And that really intrigued me, as sort of the public persona. And I think, I'm certainly a much more introverted person than he is, but I'm also an educator, and I stand in front of a group of 20 young people 3 times a week, and I kind of put on a show, and I have to sort of put on this other persona in order to make it through my job. And comedy sometimes is something that helps me through that. Sort of a self-deprecating humor is sort of helps me survive, I think, in the classroom. And so I think that spoke to me as well. And then that fear that the thing that you love most is the thing that you're not the best at. And I think that really spoke to me as well. So his sort of self-doubt, despite his genius. All of that was very appealing to me.
Well, let's go ahead and hear the rest of it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Gladstein is a small man who wears suits too big for him, which only diminishes him more. This isn't his first time appearing before HUAC. His brother-in-law is also an actor, blacklisted for once attending a meeting of the IWW while working for the Federal Theater Project. He's generally dark and dour, though Zero is grateful to him for taking on his case, especially pro bono. Something about his demeanor brings out the worst in Zero. He spends the entire flight from San Francisco to Los Angeles trying to get a rise out of Gladstein by jiggling his chair and saying he's sure the plane is going down. Any minute, there'll be a smoking pile of twisted metal and liquefied organs, and thank God he can forget about the hearing. Gladstein does what he can to mollify him, mutters what he must imagine to be comforting words, though after about 20 minutes, it's clear that Zero's anxiety has infected him, his knuckles white on the arms of the seat. The truth is, flying does genuinely terrify Zero. He believes every sound from the engine signals his impending death, And even before takeoff, he's drenched in sweat, the wispy bangs plastered to his forehead, his thick mustache prickling his lip. But needling Gladstein calms him, and by the time they land, he thinks, they can take everything from me, even my balls, as long as I can still paint. The hearing is in an office building only a mile from the 20th Century Fox lot, where he put in 18-hour workdays for 3 years, only to have the studio executives cut him loose without a second thought. The tribunal is already seated when he's escorted inside, 4 stern men behind tables on an elevated platform staring down as Zero and Gladstein ease into folding chairs. A pair of congressmen, Doyle and Jackson, preside, and their interrogator, Tavener, asks the initial questions. The 4th man, Wheeler, slim and nondescript, with a gray pallor to match his gray suit, stays quiet and scribbles. Doyle, the chairman, flexes a hatchet face beneath stiff white hair and strokes his gavel, which he raps vigorously to open the proceedings. Tavener has a mild Virginia accent, aristocratic, the voice of a man comfortable giving orders to servants, or perhaps, in another era, slaves. He begins with straightforward questions about Zero's education and employment history, and when Zero says he worked in films, Tavener's mouth forms an exaggerated expression of puzzled irritation. Do you mean movies? He asks. Zero is aware of Gladstein beside him, his shoe a scuffed wingtip, too cheap, Zero thinks, for a lawyer who wins his cases, nudging his heel. They agreed during the cab ride that Zero would take the 5th on any question related to his political affiliations, that he should generally avoid saying too much. So for now, he answers, yes, movies, and bites the inside of his cheek to keep from adding more. For a while, all they want to know from him is where he was when shooting these movies and what dates he'd been there. They are particularly interested in his activities in Hollywood. They ask about people he might have encountered and groups he might have joined. These questions he refuses to answer based on his constitutional rights. Eventually, they get to the point, naming the date of a particular party at the home of a Mr. Lionel Stander, to which Zero is able to respond definitively that he wasn't in California then and couldn't possibly have attended the party. When asked additional questions about whether he was a member of a communist fraction in California in 1938, he again invokes his constitutional rights, and only then does Jackson speak up, a square-jawed former Marine colonel close to Zero's age, though with a full head of black hair, oiled and parted, and a look of disgust as he takes in the hulking Jew actor and his scrawny Jew lawyer. Zero can tell just by the way he holds his head that he believes the blacklist isn't enough for him, nor prison either. And though he may be proud to have had a hand in toppling Hitler, there were certain things the man might have gotten right, especially now that commies crawled out of every corner. Zero glances at Gladstein to see if he's thinking similar thoughts, but the lawyer only stares glumly at his notebook, scratching words Zero can't read. What Jackson objects to is Zero having answered definitively that he wasn't in Los Angeles on the date of the Standard Party, and then invoking his rights when asked follow-up questions. Why refuse to answer after already answering? If he wasn't in California at the time, a truthful answer about his affiliations couldn't possibly incriminate him. His logic is sound, but Zero holds firm, and Chairman Doyle, irritated, raps his gavel and moves on. The longer the hearing lasts, the less Zero can control the feeling that used to creep up on him during his gallery talks, as if some small cackling animal were taking over his gestures and words. Though Gladstein occasionally nudges him with an elbow, he can't help letting out a quip about 18th Century Fox, or correcting Doyle when he quotes from a flyer advertising a meeting of the Voice of Freedom Committee. Actually, sir, he says, holding up the photostatic copy, it says here that the meeting began at 8:15 p.m., not 8. Above all, they want him to name names, so each time they mention someone he once knew or half remembered from a gathering a decade ago, he recites the name silently, over and over, until it becomes a collection of nonsense sounds unrelated to any person. It does unnerve him that they know so much about him, can track most of his movements for a dozen years. But they understand nothing about his painting. That is the one thing he can keep to himself. And while Tavener and Doyle speak, he pictures his studio, the freshly stretched canvases, the half-used tubes of pigment, the smell of gesso and linseed, the stool he could hunch over for hours without noticing, this big body that all by itself could make people laugh when he heaved it around a stage. One of the things they do know is that he performed at a meeting organized by the editors of Mainstream, a tiny magazine hardly anyone who doesn't write for it reads. Did he know the magazine was an organ of the Communist Party? Doyle asks, to which Zero replies that he's a working entertainer, that he has to make a living, and that he takes what jobs are offered to him. And that when he entertains, he keeps his political beliefs to himself. And that's when Jackson asserts himself again, leans across the high table and glares down at him, makes a speech about how the communists benefit from such propaganda. By entertaining for them, he puts monies into their coffers. And that is just as bad, Jackson insists, as plotting to overthrow the United States government. And though Gladstein puts a hand on his arm, here again, Zero can't stop himself from answering. The cackling little animal has full possession of him now, though he ducks his head submissively before raising his eyes to meet Jackson's. I appreciate your opinion very much, he tells the ex-Marine, who appears, when he isn't speaking, to be grinding his molars flat. But I do want to say, Zero goes on, as impassively as he can manage, if I appeared there, what if I did an imitation of a butterfly at rest? Wheeler, silent until now, coughs to cover a laugh. Jackson, red-faced, answers through his teeth, if your interpretation of a butterfly at rest brought any money into the coffers of the Communist Party, you contributed directly to the propaganda efforts of the Communist Party. Suppose, Zero says, misty-eyed now, rising and bending forward, arms stretching behind even as Gladstein hauls him back and down into his seat. Suppose I had the urge to do the butterfly at rest somewhere. Please, Doyle interrupts, rapping his gavel harder now. Don't have such an urge to put the butterfly at rest by putting some money in the Communist Party coffers. Put the bug to rest somewhere else next time. Jackson, subdued now, leans back in his seat and says, I suggest we put this hearing butterfly to rest. Doyle moves to adjourn, and Gladstein, with no attempt to hide his relief, asks if the witness is excused. He tries to hustle Zero out of the room as quickly as possible. But the animal has been let loose now, and as he reaches the door, Zero glances over his shoulder with a half-mad smirk and dancing eyebrows that will one day be famous around the world, and calls out, you remember what I said to you. It takes all his effort to keep from doing a little tap dance in the hallway where cameras are waiting. Ah, they're letting me back on television, he says, first time in years. Then he lets Gladstein answer reporters' questions soberly, saying his client has done nothing wrong, that the committee is relying on the testimony of a proven liar. You really don't want to work anymore, do you? Gladstein says on their way outside into that impossibly bright Hollywood October, the sky so blue it makes Zero think of sucking on a giant popsicle. He's suddenly famished, would eat a crust of bread if he saw one in the gutter, would fight off the pigeons for it, or eat them too. There are breasts bulging out of dresses everywhere he looks, and perfect ankles flashing under hems, and yes, he wants to work, wants to walk straight on to one of those movie sets just down the road and flutter his wings, bigger and more beautiful than he could have imagined, for everyone to see. To Gladstein, he says, I'm a happy pinko painter. What do I need any of this for? On the plane ride home at the end of his run, he sits alone, the seat next to him empty, and he's alternately stricken and bored, his hands so sweaty on the armrests, the palms are chafed when he lands in New York. Kate and the boys greet him, and when she asks under her breath if there have been any repercussions from the hearing, meaning he supposes, will he go to prison? He says, they gave me a Medal of Honor. I taught them everything they need to know about being patriotic. The next morning, after breakfast, he rides the subway downtown, buys a bouquet of white zinnias from the first flower stall he passes, and carries it up to his studio. But even after he's settled in, he can't get the paint to behave as he wants, can't forget the bulk of his body, which hangs awkwardly over the stool, a twinge in his neck from leaning forward. And those goddamn wings on his back, flapping every time he stirs, nothing he can do to keep them still. The long remainder of his life stretches out before him, his usefulness cut short by the pittance he raised for the coffers of a handful of wild-eyed Jews who can't collectively agree on the placement of a comma, much less work together to overthrow the government and usher in a socialist utopia. Why does he have to be so much better at prancing across a stage or furrowing his brow or reciting lines from an overwrought script than at moving brushes over canvas, the one thing he's always wanted to do more skillfully than anything else? What sort of dignity is there in being a permanent amateur, while his wife pays the bills teaching other women how to wag their asses in leotards. For hours, he doesn't lay a single brushstroke. He hardly even moves, just stares at the clownish self-portrait, the chaplain hat sitting uncomfortably on the head that isn't chaplainesque at all, far too bulbous and jowly, the mustache too wide. A head that's all his, a big zero, atop a body not as adept as Chaplin's, perhaps, but one people would have paid good money to watch, if not for the idiocy of small-minded men. He's suddenly sure it's wasted here, slumped alone in this loft full of fumes, but he has no idea what else to do with it. This time, when Kate knocks, she waits for him to answer before entering. Her look is tender, sympathetic, and scared. I'm on my way to Henry's, she says, but before I left, you got a phone call. Al from the Mulberry. He wants to book you for next week. That thief, he says, trying not to show anything on his face, the wisps of hair flapping above his forehead in a breeze he can't otherwise feel. After he swindled me the last time I was there, I didn't commit, told him you get back to him. I suppose I should do it. You don't have to, you can wait for something else. We need the money. Word's gotten around, she says, what you said at the committee. Gladstein, he must have talked to Sam. That you didn't give any names, that you made those congressmen look like fools. I sank us for good, he says. They think you're a hero, the blacklisters anyway. Al said the club doesn't care if you're Lenin's first cousin. He wants to get you in regularly. For peanuts. I told him you'll only do it for the full fee, and that he has to pay you before you're set. I'll think about it, he says, slowly, eyes shifting toward the canvas he's barely touched. As soon as I'm done in here. She steps forward and kisses him, and this time there's no paint on his smock to smudge her. Her blouse is as fresh and white as the zinnias when she backs away. He can't tell if there's pride or despair in the lines around her lovely eyes, this long-legged Gentile who somehow followed him home and never left, though now she turns and hurries out, abandoning him to easels and pigments and oil. He cleans his brushes and puts them away. To Zero as chaplain, he tips an imaginary hat. Then he puts a flower in his buttonhole and waddles across the studio as if his shoes are 3 sizes too big. Thanks so much for listening.
Oh, thank you. Wow. Well, I see why you chose this for tonight too. Now that we've gotten to the end of it, and I guess feel drawn to ask about this idea of art as a response to power, and maybe absurdity as a response to power. Several weeks ago, we had David Barton, who was a biographer of Václav Havel, and talked about Havel's, being drawn to the absurd and then becoming a powerful person later in life. But can you talk about maybe the origins of this story and the current politics and also this idea of art as a response to power?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I really do think for me, what drew me to this material first is just how powerless I have felt over the past 4 years and how much I wake up every day and feel like I have no idea what to do in the face of so much challenge. And that has not changed at all. And I don't think will change anytime soon. But what I loved so much about finding Zero's story of quiet resistance is utterly being oneself, right? And sort of by being oneself, reflecting the ridiculousness of the rhetoric that was oppressing people at that time. And he really, it changed things for not just for him after his hearing, but there was a whole series of people who their hearings were canceled or their sort of blacklist for certain people was lifted because he just made the whole thing look so ridiculous. So that small act of just letting himself be himself in this moment had this greater impact, and that I just found so moving. So I don't know that I have much more answer to what sort of power does art have, but I think I've seen it more in comedians' responses to the ridiculousness of the last 4 years. I think we'd be in a really different place right now if we hadn't had those people reflecting back the absurdity of the moment we're in, right? And so I guess art acting as a mirror, but in a funhouse mirror to sort of show you in a distorted way what it is we're actually facing. But in that distortion comes the absolute truth, and you see things more clearly than you would otherwise.
All right, great, thank you. I'm going to shift fields here a bit. I know you work in several genres, and I spent some time. I read your memoir this week, and I guess I want to ask you about Philip Roth, and it seems like you have a definitely a push-pull relationship with him as his writing, and maybe him as a you know, a voice over your shoulder. And can you talk about Philip Roth and your connection with him, and you know, I guess being a Jewish writer, and I'd just love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. So, you know, that the memoir that Brad's referring to is called the Next Scott Nadelson, and it the sort of the trigger moment, at least in my sort of crafting of this memoir, was giving a reading from my very first book and having an audience member respond to me by coming up and saying, "You're the next fucking Philip Roth," which I thought was a really, you know, absurd thing for him to say. But I found it funny at the time. But it made me just think about the influence of a figure like Roth, who's such a monumental figure, and then to be a male Jewish writer from New Jersey, and the way that the shadow of that figure sort of hovers over me. And my, you know, the response that I didn't say to that person who said that to me at the time was that, you know, at that point, I'd only ever read, and I still have only ever read 3 of Roth's books, and I can't read anymore because of the influence is kind of so heavy, that the shadow of his figure over somebody who sort of grew up in the next generation, but of this, you know, sort of same ilk. And he, American Pastoral takes place in the town next to the one that I grew up in, and so to have that influence is pretty overwhelming. So I got to really sort of think about it in a sense of more a comedic sense of how his influences has overwhelmed me, and my avoiding of actually falling into that influence, and then accidentally sort of becoming a kind of Philip Roth character myself. That's sort of where the memoir takes off from. So I love Roth. I mean, the work I've read is hugely important to me. So Goodbye Columbus was a book I read very early in my writing life, and means a ton to me. I love those stories. And The Ghostwriter is one of my favorite novels, and Portnoy still is very important to me. But I just decided I had to cut the cord there, because the influence is so overwhelming, and then I have also found myself drawn in other directions. So I was really sad when he died a couple of years ago, though. I miss him.
Another New Jersey figure that appears in the book, or toward the end of the book, is Bruce Springsteen. And I know you live now on the West Coast, and so you've lived on both coasts. How does Bruce Springsteen live in you today? I
mean, he's still an important figure for me. I actually found myself the day after, not the day after the most recent election, but the day when we actually knew what the results of this most recent election were going to look like. I found myself putting on Springsteen's song "Better Days." So I mean, it's one of those. I don't listen to a ton of him. I watched his Broadway show when it was released on video, and I thought it was great. And I love some of his songs, but it's also kind of a little bit of a push-pull, like it's almost like cliche to be from New Jersey and like Bruce Springsteen too much. But I did, when I was a teenager, we would drive down to Asbury Park. There was always a rumor that he was going to show up. There were 2 big music clubs there. And at the time in the late 1980s, it was just a wreck of a town. There was hardly anything really there. But there was a band called Southside Johnny and the Dukes, and the Jukes. They were a big New Jersey club rock band. There was always a rumor that Springsteen was going to show up at one of their shows. So we would drive 2 hours and listen to this terrible, bar rock music, and Springsteen never showed up. So I still hold out hope. I'll get to
Sounds like
see
there's a story to write in that, maybe, huh?
Absolutely. Yeah. Anybody who grew up in New Jersey in the 80s would know that experience.
Yeah. Well, what do you have? Do you have something else to read to close us out with?
Sure, I can.
Yeah.
How much time do we have? I can read a little short something.
About 10 minutes.
Okay.
10, 12 minutes.
Sure. Yeah. Let me read one more thing then. So since I read you one of the historical stories, I think I should close off with one of the more autobiographical things. And so this one's really short. I think I'll just read the very first story in the book, which is called Squatter. And it's actually just a single paragraph long. It goes on for about 3 pages, but it's just one paragraph. So if you're picturing what the experience of reading would be like. Squatter. He broke in the day after we'd moved out, so he'd likely been watching the place for some time. Maybe since the realtor first put a sign in the yard. That was 3 months earlier, but we'd yet to get an offer on the house. It was mid-2011, the market still sinking to undetermined depths. And even at $30,000 less than what we paid for it, few people were interested in walking through. But this guy wanted to live here. He clearly appreciated the work we put into the old bungalow, remodeling kitchens and bathrooms, refinishing floors, replacing rotten boards on the back deck. Afterward, from scattered evidence, we pieced together his visit. On the sliding glass door, 2 greasy smudges, the imprint of forehead and nose as he peered in to make sure no one had stayed behind. Then, around the side, footprints in the oxalis, where he tested each window until discovering the one with a broken lock. What a thrill to feel the sash budge, and then, crouching in the camellia, listen for the alarm that didn't sound. And how carefully he climbed in to avoid knocking over the lamp, to keep from soiling the armchair we'd left to stage the place for potential buyers. There were other things we'd left too. 6 dishes on the kitchen's open shelves, a few cast iron pans, air mattresses on cardboard boxes made up to look like beds. And in the garage, a case of Riesling my father-in-law had given us when he thinned out his wine cellar, cast-offs we'd been storing for a year and never intended to drink. The stuff was sweet and warm, but our guy couldn't believe his luck when he found it, dragging the box inside, setting it in a place of prominence on the old farm table we used as a butcher block island in the middle of the kitchen floor. We hadn't left him a corkscrew. How thoughtless. But he was resourceful enough to punch the cork in with a butter knife chisel and saucepan hammer. I don't know if it was before or after opening the first bottle that he decided to get some food. But eventually, he let himself out the back door, which he left open a crack, maybe forgetfully, maybe for fresh air, and returned with a bag from Safeway. And what did he pick out? A tub of salad greens, bottles of oil and vinegar, scallions he sauteed in one of the cast iron pans on the vintage Chambers stove we'd found on Craigslist. Salad, sauteed scallions. Did he always eat this way? I want to believe it was a special night for him, that the house, though small and old and surrounded by decaying apartment buildings and group homes for the mentally ill, was the most elegant he'd occupied for years, that he admired the people who lived here and had restored it so affectionately, that imagining them made him want to live as they did, cooking healthy food, drinking hand-me-down wine they couldn't afford to buy themselves. And what a night it was. The first bottle he finished while cooking, leaving it empty in the kitchen sink. The second he drank while eating his salad and a bag of tortilla chips on the air mattress in what had been our bedroom. Only he didn't realize it was an air mattress at first because he sat on it hard, collapsing the cardboard boxes underneath. Salad dressing and wine spilled on the sheets, but he enjoyed his meal anyway, left the plates on the mattress, and fetched a third bottle of Riesling. That one he drank in the front bedroom, which had been my office, this time taking the boxes away first and laying the air mattress on the floor. Did he browse the dozen or so books I'd left on the shelf and appreciate my taste in literature? Did he pass the time with a Chekhov story, The Kiss maybe, or The Darling, or peruse recipes in my vegetarian cookbook? All I know for sure is that here he spent the night, getting up only once as far as I could tell, to relieve himself on the baseboard in the corner of the room. And why not? For tonight, this was his house, and he could do with it what he pleased. If that meant splattering urine on the wall and floor and downing 3 bottles of warm white wine, so be it. Why begrudge him that, when I'd enjoyed so many nights here, strolling in the garden, cooking dinner on the chamber stove, making love under the cracked plaster ceilings, conceiving my daughter? How could I walk away from the place just because it felt too small now that I had a child, the neighborhood too dodgy, the school district's rating too low? Shouldn't I have done more to honor all I put into it, all it had given me in return? I want to believe my guy took in the perfect tight grain of the old floorboards before lying down and shutting his eyes. I want to believe he caught a glimpse of the moon made wavy by the leaded window, that the surprise of it tickled out a little hiccup of laughter. I want to believe he slept a heavy sleep in my old office, that he dreamt rapturous dreams. Because I know it must have been a rough awakening when the realtor opened the lockbox and jingled the key early the next morning, leading in a young couple who wanted just this kind of old place with a big yard, so long as it was free of rot and its roof didn't need replacing and its cellars could come down another 20,000 off the asking price. How cruel to face the daylight slicing through the tall windows, to scramble up from the floor and crouch in the closet, waiting to run out the front door, to hear the couple exclaiming over high ceilings and laminate countertops they'd mistaken for real marble, to hear the realtor shouting after him and telling the couple to call the police, to feel the pavement rattling from shins to throbbing head, to pass for sale signs in the yards of sagging bungalows with patchwork siding and crumbling chimneys and weedy lawns, and to know, once more, that nothing as ecstatic as love's first flare ever lasts. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you. What a great way to end the evening. Such a pleasure to have you, Scott. And are you able to stick around for a few minutes as we open up the room to have people talk and ask a question or two?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. Thank you all so much for having me and for being here.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Juniper, and thank you, Carmel, our founder. And I look forward to next week. And yeah, go ahead and open the room up, Juniper. Let's.
Yeah, everybody can unmute themselves now. Next week is David Yulin, the former LA Times editor and works in multiple genres. And you're welcome to unmute yourself now to say hello or ask a question.
The Zero Mostel story is almost a period piece, but the characters aren't stereotypes. I mean, you seem to have it both ways with those characters. They aren't clownish Jewish ex-communist or anything like that. And it's also deftly done. Do you think that you're talking about something basic in American society, that it's possible for these days to come back, and that when they come back, you need the resources to encounter them that someone like Zero Mostel showed? I mean, is he an exemplary figure for you in some ways?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I wish I had a definitive answer, but I mean, this is my hope is that that real art and real artists, which also then translate into full complex human beings, right? With the capacity for empathy and capacity for complexity, that always rises, that always finds its way through, right? And to, I guess for me to honor him, and I really appreciate what you said, that he comes across in the story as a sort of full-blown human being. It's the thing that I loved about reading about him, was finding that he wasn't just one thing, right? He was multiple things, and he sort of brought all of himself into his work, and that's what made him so vibrant. And I think I'm always looking for artists to be able to speak to that multiplicity and that full complexity of being human. And I think it always finds its way, and I think our culture doesn't value it in the same way that maybe it did during his
Oh, that's interesting. In the 50s, that it's less valued.
Well, I think when he became most popular was in the 60s and 70s, and there I think there was this flourishing after this period of such suppression in the 50s. So maybe it's that cycle that we have, and maybe so maybe we can all wish that we're heading out of a low period in that cycle and back into a flourishing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Anybody else? Thank you, Phil. That was a great question. You else want to say hello or ask a question?
I didn't realize that the McCarthy hearings would be taking place on the West Coast. I thought most had to go to Congress and present their case. I did see Zero Mostel and Fiddler on the Roof in New York. This is kind of a quirky question, but as his character, he wore these very, very thick lenses in his glasses. And as soon as the lights hit him, it was like, wow. So what, did he really have eye issues, or that was just a part of his outfit? I know it's not a super question, but it was the one about the historical fact. I appreciated deeply because I wasn't sure. I never knew that they were out in Los Angeles or wherever in California.
Yeah, and I mean, most of them took place in DC, but they would, especially because they were so interested in what was happening in Hollywood. There was a subcommittee of a couple of congressmen from California, and they would bring in, so Doyle and Jackson were the two main figures on that committee, and they would hold these separate hearings in California, basically trying to harass the movie industry and people in the movie industry, and try and so I think Zero actually, and this I had to sort of smooth. And this is always the thing when you're writing historical material and you want to stay true to the historical record, but there are also certain inconvenience details that I have to elide. So I think originally he was called into the hearing in DC, but he had this show booked already, or this tour booked on the West Coast, and so they called him into that hearing. But it actually did take place in Los Angeles, and you can find the transcripts to those hearings online, which is they're fascinating to read. A lot of them are, I mean, they don't really let the people say much. It's a lot of the Congress people lecturing them about how bad communism is. But then finding these moments where Zero would sort of come to life was amazing.
I've worked with some of the transcripts, and you capture the absurdity of the transcripts, which is on the surface.
Yeah.
They are the straight men.
Sounds like
that's cool.
Sounds like the politicians themselves were envious of the wanting to be in showbiz.
Well, they were. I mean, they were putting on such a performance for each other, and clearly a performance for the newspapers. There were TV cameras not in the room but outside, and there was it was such a show. Absolutely.
Well, great. Well, anyone else before we close the meeting? Thank you for being here, everybody, especially Scott and Juniper and Carmel and Phil. And yeah, it's wonderful. I just love this every Sunday night. Such a sense of community we're building and just ritual. It's just a lovely thing we're doing here. Not to pat ourselves on the back, but I get a lot from it. I know. So thanks, Scott.
Thank you all so much. You'll love David Yulin. He's terrific. I got to see him read a couple
Oh,
years ago.
good.
So enjoy next week.
That's
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you,
Really
Scott.
appreciate spending time with you again and you and your words. I really appreciate you collaborating.
Yeah,
great
and
to
you're a
meet you.
Jersey guy, so that's even more important.
Yeah, go Jersey.
You got it. Thank you. It was wonderful.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you
Good
all.
night.
Good
Bye.
night.
Thanks again.
Bye.
Adrian.